In the spring of 1983, a farmer named Russell Hayes received a letter from the United States Department of Agriculture that most farmers in a situation were considered a gift from heaven. The government was offering him $18,000, cash up front, to not plant corn on 120 acres of his 400-acre farm in Shelby County, Iowa. This was part of the Payment in Kind Program, or PIK, a massive federal initiative designed to reduce grain surpluses that were crushing commodity prices and bankrupting farmers across the Midwest. All Russell had to do was sign the papers, agree to leave those 120 acres idle for one growing season, and the government would send him a check for $18,000, plus give him payment in stored government grain equivalent to what he would have harvested. It was free money for not working. His wife begged him to take it. His banker advised him to take it. Every neighbor he talked to was taking similar deals. But Russell Hayes, 46 years old, stubborn as a mule, and convinced he knew better than the federal government, refused. He planted all 400 acres. What happened over the next 18 months nearly destroyed him, cost him his marriage, and taught him a lesson about hubris and agricultural economics that he'd spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Before I explain exactly why Russell Hayes made the catastrophic decision to reject $18,000 in free government money, you need to understand the agricultural crisis of 1983 and the desperate measures the government was taking to address it. By early 1983, American agriculture was in its worst condition since the Great Depression. The boom years of the 1970s, when commodity prices had soared and land values had exploded, had turned into a nightmare. Corn prices had collapsed from over $3 per bushel in 1973 to $74 to around $2.20 by 1983, and were still falling. Wheat, soybeans, and other commodities have followed similar trajectories. Meanwhile, input costs, fuel, fertilizer, chemicals, equipment, had continued rising. The cost-price squeeze was crushing farmers who borrowed heavily during the boom years. But the problem wasn't just prices. It was surplus. American farmers, encouraged by government policies and agricultural economists to plant fence row to fence row during the 1970s, had produced so much grain that storage facilities were overflowing. According to USDA data, corn stocks in 1982 were over 3.4 billion bushels, the highest level in history. The government itself was storing over 2 billion bushels in the Commodity Credit Corporation, grain that farmers had forfeited when they couldn't repay their CCC loans. This massive surplus was depressing prices, which hurt farmers, which led to more loan defaults, which added to the surplus. It was a death spiral. The Reagan administration's response was a Payment in Kind program, announced in January 1983. The concept was simple but radical. Pay farmers to not produce. If farmers voluntarily idled a portion of their cropland, anywhere from 10 to 30% of their base acres, the government would compensate them with payments in the form of stored government grain. The farmer could then sell that grain at market prices, essentially getting paid for a crop they didn't have to plant, tend, or harvest. The program was voluntary, but the incentives were enormous. For a typical Iowa corn farmer in 1983, participating in PIK meant receiving payment equivalent to perhaps 80 to 90 bushels per acre for land they didn't have to work, with no input costs, no labor, and no risk. Economists projected that if enough farmers participated, it would reduce planted acreage by 20 to 30 million acres nationally, draw down the surplus, and eventually support higher prices. It was theoretically a win-win. Farmers got guaranteed income without costs or risk. The government reduced the surplus. Prices would stabilize. Everyone would benefit. Over 82 million acres were eventually enrolled in PIK, the largest acreage reduction program in American history. In Shelby County, Iowa, participation rates exceeded 75%. Almost every farmer Russell Hayes knew had signed up. Russell Hayes thought they were all idiots. Russell had started farming in 1960 when he was 23, taking over his father's 240-acre operation. He'd expanded slowly over the years, buying an additional 160 acres in 1975, bringing his total to 400 acres. He'd survived the 1970s boom and the early 1980s bust by farming conservatively, avoiding heavy debt, and trusting his own judgment over government programs or expert advice. He had some equipment debt, About $28,000 on a John Deere 4240 he'd bought in 1979. But his land was paid off and his operating costs were relatively low. He was one of the better farmers in the county, consistently producing above-average yields through careful management and attention to detail. When the PIK program was announced, Russell's initial reaction was skepticism. He didn't trust government programs in general, and this one seemed too good to be true. His wife, Linda, saw it differently. They were in the kitchen one February evening, and she'd been reading the PIK enrollment materials the county extension office had sent out. "Russell, this is exactly what we need. We could idle 120 acres, get paid $18,000 plus grain, and reduce our costs by maybe $15,000, since we wouldn't have to plant fertilize or spray those acres. That's like $33,000 of benefit for doing nothing." Russell shook his head. "It's a trap." "How is free money a trap?" "Because the government doesn't give away free money. There's always a catch." Linda put down the papers. "The catch is you don't plant. That's it. That's the whole catch. And right now, with prices where they are, we'd probably make more money from the PIK payment than we would from actually farming those acres." Russell disagreed. "You're assuming prices stay low. Will they go up?" Linda looked at him like he was insane. "Go up? Russell, prices have been falling for 3 years. There's a grain surplus the size of Mount Rushmore. Why would prices go up?" Russell leaned back in his chair. "Because if everyone idles their land, production drops. If production drops enough, the surplus disappears. And if the surplus disappears, prices go up, maybe way up. And when that happens, I want to have a full crop to sell, not a bunch of PIK grain I got for free." It was a theory. It wasn't entirely unreasonable, but it was based on assumptions about participation rates, weather, and market dynamics that Russell couldn't possibly predict. Linda tried to reason with him. "Even if you're right and prices go up a little, you're gambling $18,000 in guaranteed money on a maybe. That's not smart." Russell's jaw set in the stubborn expression Linda had learned to dread. "I'm not taking government money to not work. I'm a farmer. I farm. That's what I do." The argument went on for weeks, but Russell wouldn't budge. He refused to enroll in PIK. His banker, a man named Jim Crowley, tried to change his mind. Jim called Russell into the bank in early March, right before the PIK enrollment deadline. "Russell, I'm looking at your loan balance and your projected income for this year. If you plant all 400 acres at current prices, you're going to net maybe $15,000 after expenses and loan payments. If you take PIK on 120 acres, you'll net over $40,000 with less work and less risk. This is a no-brainer." Russell shook his head. "I appreciate the advice, Jim, but I'm planting." Jim tried a different approach. "Let me put it this way. If you don't take PIK and you have a bad year, drought, low yields, whatever, you might not be able to make your loan payments. Then we have a problem. If you take PIK, you're guaranteed to make your payments with money left over. From my perspective as your lender, I strongly encourage you to enroll." Russell felt a flash of anger. "Are you saying if I don't take PIK, you won't renew my operating loan?" Jim backed off. "I'm not saying that. I'm saying it would make me more comfortable about your financial position. That's all." Russell stood up. "I'll make my payments. I always have." He walked out. Jim watched him go and thought, "This guy's going to learn a very expensive lesson." Russell planted all 400 acres in April and May of 1983. Corn on 320 acres, soybeans on 80. He used the same inputs he always did: fertilizer, chemicals, seed. His costs for the season were about $58,000, which was higher than usual because he was farming acreage other farmers had idled, so he couldn't share equipment or labor the way he sometimes did. But he was confident. The PIK program was going to reduce planted acres nationally by over 30%. That had to support prices eventually. All he had to do was produce a good crop and wait for the market to reward him. The summer of 1983 brought something Russell hadn't anticipated: a massive drought. It started in June with below-average rainfall across Iowa and much of Corn Belt. By July, it was clear this wasn't a normal dry spell. This was the worst drought since 1936. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees for days on end. Rainfall was less than 40% of normal. Corn across the Midwest was withering in the fields. The USDA started revising its crop production estimates downward every week. In early July, they projected a national corn crop of 6.5 billion bushels. By late August, they were projecting 4.2 billion bushels. It was a catastrophe. But here's what made it particularly cruel for Russell Hayes. The drought affected farmers who planted, but it didn't affect farmers who'd enrolled in PIK. Those farmers had idle land. They didn't have crops dying in the field. They'd already received their payments. They were sitting on their porches watching their neighbors' crops burn up, and they were fine. Russell, meanwhile, watched his 400 acres shrivel. His corn, which he'd hoped would yield 130 bushels per acre, was on track to produce maybe 60 bushels per acre if he was lucky. His soybeans looked even worse, maybe 20 bushels per acre instead of the 45 he projected. By late August, Russell knew he was in serious trouble. He ran the numbers one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with Linda watching him, her face tight with anger and worry. At 60 bushels per acre on 320 acres of corn, he'd harvest 19,200 bushels. At current prices of $2.30 per bushel, which hadn't gone up despite the drought because the massive existing surplus was buffering the impact, his gross revenue from corn would be $44,160. The soybeans would bring maybe another $9,000. Total gross, about $53,000. His costs had been $58,000. He was going to lose money before even accounting for his loan payments of $5,600 for the year. Linda finally spoke. If you'd taken PIK, we'd have $18,000 cash, plus grain payments worth another $25,000. We'd be sitting on $43,000 with costs of maybe $40,000 since we'd only be farming 280 acres. We'd be fine, Russell. We'd be more than fine. Russell didn't say anything. What could he say? She was right. He'd gambled and lost. I'm sorry, he finally said. Linda stood up. Sorry doesn't pay the bills. She left the room, and Russell sat there in the silence, feeling the weight of his mistake crushing him. But it got worse, much worse. In September, before harvest, the USDA announced the rules for the 1984 crop year, and buried in the regulations was a provision that would haunt Russell. Farmers who hadn't participated in PIK for 1983 would not be eligible for certain government programs in 1984, including disaster payments and deficiency payments that had been part of previous farm bills. The logic was that if you'd opted out of helping reduce the surplus, you shouldn't benefit from programs designed to support farmers who cooperated. Russell hadn't known about this provision. Nobody had emphasized it during the enrollment period. But it was there, and it was going to apply to him. Harvest came in October. Russell's final yields were even worse than projected. 55 bushels per acre on corn, 18 on soybeans. He sold everything immediately because he needed cash to make his loan payment. Total revenue, $48,700. Total costs, $58,000. Net loss before loan payments, $9,300. After loan payments, negative $14,900. He lost nearly $15,000 farming 400 acres during a year when most of his neighbors, enrolled in PIK, had made $30,000 to $40,000 doing nothing. Russell went to the bank in November to discuss his situation. Jim Crowley looked at the numbers and said what Russell already knew. You can't make your loan payment. You're $5,600 short, plus you got living expenses and next year's operating costs to think about. Russell had been dreading this conversation. What are my options? Jim leaned back. Honestly, not great. You could sell some equipment to raise cash, but the market's terrible right now and you'd take a huge loss. You could try to refinance, but your debt-to-income ratio is already high and I don't think I can get approved. Or you could sell some land. Russell felt sick. The land's been in my family since 1891. Jim nodded sympathetically. I know, but Russell, you made a choice when you didn't take PIK. That choice has consequences. I'm not trying to be cruel, but the bank has obligations. We need the loan serviced or we need collateral reduction. Russell asked for time. Jim gave him until January to figure something out. Russell tried everything. He approached neighbors about selling equipment, his 4240, his planter, his disc, but equipment values had collapsed during the farm crisis. The 4240, which he bought for $38,000 in 1979, was worth maybe $18,000 now, and he still owed $22,000 on the loan. Selling it would leave him with a $4,000 deficiency and no tractor. He looked into refinancing with other lenders. Nobody would touch him. His balance sheet was underwater, and he had a recent history of losses. By December, Linda had had enough. She told Russell she was taking their 2 kids, both teenagers, and moving to her sister's house in Des Moines until he figured out how to fix this mess. She didn't file for divorce, but the separation was real. Russell was alone in the farmhouse, facing the possibility of losing land that had been his family for 4 generations, because he'd been too stubborn and too proud to take $18,000 from the government. Then, in early January of 1984, something unexpected happened. The drought's impact on the 1983 crop finally started to show up in market prices. With national corn production down by over 35% from the previous year, and the PIK program having idled so much acreage, the surplus started to shrink. Corn prices began to climb. By late January, they'd hit $2.85 per bushel. By March, $3.10. By May of 1984, corn was trading above $3.40 per bushel, the highest price since 1980. Russell had no grain to sell. He'd sold everything at harvest to make loan payments. But the price increase gave him an idea. He still had the PIK grain certificates that the government had issued. Wait, no, he didn't have those because he hadn't enrolled. What he had was debt and regret. But the price increase did mean that his 1984 crop, if he could plant one, might be profitable. He went back to Jim Crowley with a proposal. Let me plant again this year. Prices are up. I can make money if I have a decent crop. Give me an operating loan. Let me defer the equipment payment for 1 year, and I'll catch up. Jim was skeptical, but not entirely unsympathetic. Russell, you're not eligible for deficiency payments this year because you didn't participate in PIK. If prices drop again, you're exposed with no safety net. And you're asking me to defer a payment you already couldn't make, which puts the bank at more risk. I need something in return. Russell knew what was coming. What do you want? I want to lien on 80 acres of your land as additional collateral. If you default on the equipment loan, we take the 80 acres to satisfy it. Russell felt like he was signing away his children, but he agreed. He had no choice. He planted 400 acres again in 1984. This time, the weather cooperated. Normal rainfall, good temperatures, no major pest or disease problems. His corn yielded 125 bushels per acre. His soybeans hit 42 bushels per acre. At $3.20 per bushel for corn and $6.80 for soybeans. Prices had risen across the board. His gross revenue was over $150,000. After costs of about $62,000, he netted $88,000. He paid off the deferred loan payment, made the current year's payment, paid down some of the principal, and sent $20,000 to Linda with a letter begging her to come home. She came home in August of 1984. The marriage was damaged. The trust was fractured, but they tried to rebuild. Russell had survived, barely, but the cost had been enormous. Financial stress, marital strain, the loss of respect from neighbors who thought he'd been a fool, the knowledge that he'd nearly lost everything because of pride and stubbornness. Over the next few years, Russell slowly recovered. He paid off the equipment loan by 1987. He never again rejected a government program without carefully analyzing the costs and benefits. And he never stopped thinking about 1983, about the $18,000 he'd turned down, about the drought he couldn't have predicted, about how close he'd come to losing the farm his great-grandfather had homesteaded. Now, let me explain the broader economic and policy context of what happened to Russell Hayes, because the story illustrates something crucial about agriculture. Sometimes the economically rational decision feels wrong emotionally, and sometimes the emotionally satisfying decision is economically catastrophic. Russell's decision to reject PIK was based on a theory that wasn't unreasonable. If enough farmers idled land, production would drop and prices would rise. He wanted to be positioned to benefit from those higher prices with a full crop. The problem was that he was betting on an outcome he couldn't control and taking on risks he couldn't afford. The PIK program did eventually help support prices, but not in 1983. In 1984 and beyond, after the drought had already devastated the farmers who planted. And even then, the price increase was driven more by the drought than by PIK itself. Russell's fundamental error was assuming he could predict market dynamics better than the collective wisdom of 82 million acres worth of farmers who'd chosen to participate in the program. He was essentially saying, everyone else is wrong and I'm right. That level of confidence requires being able to absorb the consequences if you're wrong. Russell couldn't absorb those consequences. According to agricultural economists who studied the PIK program, participation was highest among farmers who were already financially stressed. These farmers desperately needed the guaranteed income to make loan payments and survive. Farmers who rejected PIK tended to be either very financially strong and could afford to gamble, or very stubborn and convinced they knew better. Russell was in the second category. He wasn't wealthy enough to absorb a bad outcome, but he was stubborn enough to reject good advice from his wife, his banker, and every neighbor he knew. The program itself was controversial. Some economists argued it was a massive waste of taxpayer money. The government spent over $9 billion on PIK in 1983. Others argued it was necessary intervention to prevent total collapse of the agricultural economy. But regardless of whether PIK was good policy, for individual farmers the decision calculus was clear. Participation reduced risk and guaranteed income. Non-participation increased risk and offered the possibility of higher rewards. Russell chose increased risk and got catastrophically unlucky with the weather. Let me bring this into modern context, because the fundamental lesson of Russell Hayes' story is still relevant today. Federal agricultural policy still offers farmers various programs: crop insurance, subsidies, conservation programs, disaster assistance. These programs are designed to reduce risk and stabilize income. Some farmers reject them on principle, either because they distrust government involvement in agriculture or because they believe they can do better on their own. And sometimes they can. But agriculture is a business where you can do everything right and still fail due to weather, prices, disease, or other factors beyond your control. Government programs, for all their flaws, provide a safety net. The farmers I know who survived multiple agricultural crises, the 1980s farm crisis, the 2000s recession, recent trade wars and price volatility, they all have one thing in common. They use every tool available to reduce risk. They participate in crop insurance programs. They use forward contracts and hedging to lock in prices. They diversify their operations. They maintain financial reserves. They don't bet the farm on being smarter than the market. Russell Hayes bet the farm on being smarter than the market, and he nearly lost. I spent 2 weeks researching this story. I interviewed Russell Hayes directly. He's 87 years old now, long retired, but he remembers 1983 like it was yesterday. I reviewed USDA documents about the PIK program and its implementation. I studied weather data from the 1983 drought and commodity price movements from that era. I talked to agricultural economists who'd analyzed the program's impacts. And the conclusion is clear. Russell made a catastrophic decision based on pride and overconfidence, and he was extraordinarily lucky that the 1984 crop year was good enough to save him. If 1984 had brought another drought, or if prices hadn't risen, he'd have lost the farm. No question. Russell told me something in our interview that I think every farmer needs to hear. He said, "I spent 50 years farming, and I made a lot of good decisions. But turning down PIK was the stupidest thing I ever did. I was so convinced I was smarter than everyone else, so sure that I could see something they couldn't. And I was wrong. Dead wrong. I got lucky with the 84 crop, but it wasn't skill, it was luck. And you can't build a farming operation on luck. The farmers who survive are the ones who manage risk, who take the guaranteed money when it's offered, who don't gamble their family's future on pride. I learned that lesson the hard way, and it almost cost me everything. Linda Hayes, Russell's wife, is still alive and still married to Russell. When I asked her about 1983, she didn't want to talk much about it, but she did say this: "Those were the worst months of my life. Watching Russell make a decision I knew was wrong, not be able to stop him, watching it fall apart exactly the way I knew it would. I left because I couldn't stand to watch it anymore. I came back because he finally admitted he'd been wrong, and because the farm survived. But that year changed our marriage. There's still a scar there. Some mistakes you can't completely undo. The Hayes farm is still operating today. Russell's son runs it now, farming 400 acres with modern equipment and participating in every government program he qualifies for. He told me his father made him promise two things when he took over the farm: never turn down crop insurance, and never assume you're smarter than the market. Dad drilled it into me. He said, pride is expensive, usually too expensive to afford. If you're farming now, or if you're making decisions about risk management and government programs, please learn from Russell Hayes' mistake. Don't let pride or ideology or stubbornness convince you to reject tools that reduce risk. Don't gamble your farm survival on theories about what markets might do. Don't assume you can see things other people can't. The farmers who survive aren't the ones who take the biggest risks. They're the ones who manage risk most effectively. Sometimes that means taking the guaranteed money, even if it feels like giving up or accepting government interference. Because feeding your family and keeping your land matters more than being right. If this story resonates with you, if you've seen farmers make similar mistakes, or if you made them yourself, share your experience in the comments. Tell us about the decisions you made, the programs you rejected or accepted, the lessons you learned. And if you think this message matters, hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to document agricultural history and preserve the lessons that can save farms and families. Every video takes weeks of research because these stories matter. If you agree, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Russell Hayes is 87 years old now. He still lives on the farm, in the same house where he sat in 1983 watching his crops die while his neighbors who'd taken PIK sat comfortable and paid. When I asked him if he had any final thoughts about what happened, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There's a Bible verse I think about sometimes. Proverbs 16, verse 18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before fall. I was proud. I thought I knew better. And I nearly destroyed everything my family had built over 4 generations. If there's anything I want people to take from my story, it's this: be humble, listen to advice, manage risk, and when the government offers you $18,000 to not work, for God's sake, take the money." He's right. Take the money. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.